Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the podcast on negotiation. My name is Remy Smolinski, and I have a very special guest, very special treat for us. Today with me is Alain Guggenbühl, who is a practitioner and academic expert on the EU negotiations. And together we will talk about the key success factors in interstate multilateral EU negotiations, as complex as it gets. Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward, Alain, to your insights, how to make such complex negotiation setting simple and how to boil it down to six. We agreed on six success factors. And I'm very excited to find out what these success factors are. But first of all, Alain, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Well, thank you very much. Guten Abend, everyone. I'm French born in Germany, speaking from Brussels. Very pleased to be on board with you. My interest in negotiation started after my studies, when I followed a few meetings in the UN. And I have to say there were a lot of lofty declarations, ready-made talking points, fluffy speeches from the member states. You might say, as a Frenchman, I was relatively prepared for that. However, watching those statements of positions, I came to build this image of a bunch of dormant animals with large mouths, heavy to move, innocuous or inoffensive, as long as you don't disturb them too much from what they're doing. And yes, I felt like indeed I was looking at a bunch of hippos, you might say. But did you know that hippos can actually deploy tremendous strength and speed outside their pond when they can become quite powerful. So ever since then, I've been wanting to teach and advise any hippopotamus out there how to run the 30 kilometers an hour they're capable of running out of the water. That's the point. I wanted to convince them that diplomacy should be more than just floating and grabbing only what's available in the muddy waters of their territory. Most specifically, in my company, we advise now on the ways to design powerful negotiation strategy in the decision-making process you described quite well. In diplomatic terms, I would say it's chaotic, hectic. It involves 27 member states with varying positions and interests, and we try to create strategies that basically aim at influencing through negotiations. And I'm delighted to undertake with you today a very small safari in this EU jungle. Thank you. Back to you, Remy.
Thank you so much, Alain. It sounds very exciting. If someone has not had appetite for our episode before, then actually going on a negotiation safari, it's something that everybody is probably very much looking forward to. Alain, I've read that you've trained almost every EU presidency so far. I would be very interested to find out some intimate details in terms of their biggest successes, the biggest failures. Who was the best? Who was the worst? What is your in hindsight and retrospective? What was the best presidency? What was the biggest success? What was the biggest failure? What do you think?
A lot of moderate failures, a handful of successes. But before, and rather than pointing a few, allow me to share with you two criteria whereby I could locate them as successes or failure. To be successful, I believe any EU presidency has to manage to enforce two, like we call in negotiation theory, two types of justices. They need to enforce a procedural justice whereby everybody's treated in a relatively equal way as a member of a club when they give them the floor, when the presidency approaches them to fetch information, to echo their interest in the compromise text. But they also have to add another justice, which is the distributional one, which is to share advantages of successive compromises. for 27 member states, because these guys have to survive 6 months. So the golden rule is not always the same winners, not always the same losers. So like it's Christmas time every day, and that's the very job of a presidency. And if a presidency fails to kind of have this equity or fairness, well, they will have resistance in the group, and the 6 months will more or less lead to a high number of agreements or not. And the second criteria is you succeed when you manage presidency if you are so-called Brussels-based, if the people in charge of the negotiations are sufficiently autonomous, independent from political pressures from their capital. And here's my answer to your questions about what's the most successful presidencies of all time. We think it's the presidency which run for 6 months without a government in place. Any government with ministers saying do this, do that, achieve this, and that was a country which I happen to know quite well because I'm located in it, which at some stage in its political history was without a government for more than 500 days. We're talking indeed about Belgium. And the Belgian negotiators were free to try things out, speak to everyone, and be creative. And this was the best moment of EU presidency history, I would say, for those two reasons.
That's very exciting, because one of the things that you wrote in one of your papers is, to be successful, you have to know what to do, right? So you have to have a clear mandate. And it seems that a strict mandate, maybe not clear, but a very strict mandate might also be counterproductive. That would be an example of Belgium, which had a widely defined mandate, right? No constituency breathing down their necks. And still very successful. That's exciting. I'll have to have a closer look at this. Alain, I was with Francesco in one of our last episodes. We talked about negotiation not only as an individual competency, but also we looked at negotiation as an organizational competency, right? And we looked at the EU being more or less in certain areas and certain institutions certainly better, and certain institutions a little bit lagging behind in terms of negotiation competency. What is your view in terms of negotiation competencies in the EU institutions, both on the individual level, as well as collective competency of the organization? Apparently, it must not be perfect, because they keep on getting you, inviting you to give them trainings, right? So, what is your assessment after all these years working with so many EU officials?
Well, vast question. I would point at 3 or 4. Let me say 4 such competencies, and you'll see they'll mingle the individuals and the organizations, but it's a kind of a joint effectiveness, joint efficiency, I would call. The first set of competencies is crucial, is the importance of unwritten rules. The textbook says something, the treaty says something, there's a voting procedure, and then on the ground something totally different happens, like the Monty Pythons would say in some of their circuses. One example: if you expect to come to the meetings and speak in the microphone and being listened at, you're totally wrong, because most of the time it's too late. The counterpart will be doing something totally different again. A lot has been pre-cooked already. Everybody knows what you're going to say anyway. Things have been bargained already somehow before you speak. And even worse, Remy, I've seen situations where the report on the minutes of the meeting about to take place was ready before the meeting itself. Because roughly we know there's a routine. We know what will come out of Greece on the environment, or from France on energy. There are no surprises. So if you count only on those textbooks, rules and procedure, you'll be quite surprised. And you see how it merges institutions, the rules of procedure of the body, and individuals as a functioning agent. The second competence, I would say, is also crucial, and it boils back to the very nature of negotiations in the EU. you are dealing with people holding a mandate to negotiate. And who speaks about mandates, speaks about national instructions. So national instructions are prepared home. And the competency I would advise people to have is to have a horizontal vision as opposed to a tunnel vision, because you need to be able to sacrifice something somewhere for the sake of gaining a benefit elsewhere. And that you can't do if you have your head down in just your file. We've seen that recently. To negotiate environment, you have to know what trade-offs you can do in energy, transport, or regional policy, or fundamental rights, or the rule of law, if you see my point, or vice versa. So putting your house in order is the second competency, I would say, and choose your battle. The third one, and we refer to for the presidency, it's the same for the national negotiators. I would advocate them to have the appropriate margin of maneuver and autonomy to use the corridors, to use the green rooms, to speak to everyone, to answer to this. Could you live with that? Okay, have a rough idea, rather than to depend fully on your authority. Because if you do that, you won't be able to influence an inch the entire process. And the more you're open, approaching people and ready to answer, to investigate things, the more the others will turn to you. I mean, it's the basic building of confidence process that will take place. Last but not least, like in any international negotiation, you know that, Remy, more than I do, you need physical preparedness, technical preparedness, and political preparedness. So prepare yourself, if you go to Brussels to negotiate, to be harassed by the others, by the chair, by the leader of the coalitions. If you say, I want this, and you don't justify it, if you speak too long, if you don't have any alternative proposal, if you say, niet, no, nein, that is not enough. They will not let you out of the hook. And if you simply behave like a robot, well, again, people will not want to speak to you or to share information. So the clock will be stopped, and long nights, you will need to spend long nights, but this is where the deals are basically crafted.
Okay.
Hope that makes some sense about not scaring too much our viewers, but voila, the reality of the preparation means these four elements in particular.
Mm-hmm. So let me summarize briefly. Physical, technical, political preparedness, preparation, autonomy. In a network, you mentioned horizontal versus tunnel vision, and knowledge of unwritten rules combined with the willingness to do the corridor diplomacy. Which one of these competencies do you believe is the largest asset, where you have almost, where you're unemployed in terms of your trainings, where you don't have to do much, right? And which of those competencies that do you have to focus the most in terms of bringing people or teaching people, how to do certain things in a particular way?
Well, thank you for that. I mean, in negotiation, we have a tendency to approach the subject matter from the angle of the procedure or the problem, or essentially. Whereas I advocate usually to look at another facet, which is the role of the persons, the people, the individuals. And that's what I would say, this is where lies the biggest challenge for officials or diplomats who are not used to socialize, to exchange things. They're bound by rules, by cultural preference of the organization. Information is very often power. So it's feeling comfortable in this world where basically 80% of the time needed to come to an agreement, we checked, 80% roughly of the time needed is spent in the corridors. Only 20% in the meeting room, which gives you a sense of the challenge if you're not familiar from your either cultural organization or your background into that. And the most easier one is, okay, voting procedure, I have 15 votes to express, this is okay. For that matter, they're ready. But it's really the people's angle, which is the most challenging bits.
Mm-hmm. That's very surprising, I must admit, Alain. You surprised me with your choice, because I thought that if there is an element of diplomacy that diplomats must possess, or at least must be proficient at, that would be winning people, right? I mean, that's their business. It's not only rules, it's not only regulations, it's not only about being a technocrat. It's about being being, great diplomats from the past, right? They were also charming individuals. They were also individuals who were able to win people, right? People, not only win bad diplomatic battles, to be eloquent and so on. So I must admit, I'm a bit surprised by your choice, but that also signifies, the importance of emphasizing this relational dimension almost in every negotiation. We typically tend to focus on the substance and forget about that it's ultimately the people who make decisions, right?
You're right. I have to specify that when we speak about national representatives in EU negotiations, we're talking about people going in roughly 10,000 meetings a year. And within this 10,000 meetings a year, you have a few dozens from the ministers themselves. And you have like 80 meetings from the ambassadors themselves. And then you have thousands from representative of a lower level, people working in Brussels, staying in Brussels, and then you have people flying in from the capitals. So that makes 4 categories where, I would need to enter into some specificities, but the main challenge, if you allow me then to bounce on what you said, Remy, the main challenge for all of them then is to have a sufficient knowledge, awareness of the cultural differences when it comes to use those corridors. How much transparent should the entire thing be? Should you be discussing business after working hours? Should you accept the invitation of the Finnish representative to go and meet him or her in the sauna of the embassy? All that is part of the unwritten rules again. So this is the two worlds merging. And the more you attend those meetings, the more you're familiar, not so much with the socialization, brutally speaking, but with those personal preference, and you can adapt and use that to your advantage. These are the good negotiators using the socialization for strategic purpose, not to become friends, but for strategic purpose to influence the others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alain, for these insights. I liked the introduction of your paper, which said that multilateral EU negotiations can be compared to a group dance, which is observed by diverse judges. Right, some of them are located in different places, but there is one overall judge which looks at how the group of 27 dance, whereas individual judges observe their own dancing couples or units, right? I liked it a lot. I like this analogy a lot, and we know that in negotiation education, we very often compare the process that we analyze or look at with dancing. And I was wondering about the success factors that you would recommend, or that you were able to distill and extract based on the analysis of, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of EU negotiation processes. Would you mind sharing your insights with us? What it means to negotiate well, what it means to group dance well in the context of EU multilateral negotiations?
Glad to, Remy. Yes, of course. Thank you for that. The first thing I would say is avoid stepping on your neighbor's or your partner's toes, which in negotiation means respect the other, right? Would be interested with more time to elucidate a bit that. But allow me to point out those 6 factors which indeed I have in mind. I'd be interested to have you react on this listing, of course. The first one might be quite evident and hot water rather for everyone. It's a plan things and what you expect to win. So having a hierarchy of your interests, having a saliency of interest, what is more important than something else. It's not always easy, yeah. If you look at legislative matters, red lines ready, trade-offs ready, alternatives ready again, and very important, your minimum level of satisfaction. And how much frustration can you afford at the end of the day? Because you're going to be frustrated. You're not going to have what you wanted in the first place. Some will have it, have more, dance better. But you have to decide that from the outset to prepare the next negotiation and then the next negotiation. But this level of satisfaction, minimum one, is crucial to me. And that's back to the preparation, the coordination internally, back in the ministries. The second is to bounce back on the discussion on socialization, is what negotiation theory calls coalescence. Let's call this coalition building, which are two types. We talked about, or we haven't talked about, but building tactical coalitions with delegations sharing your positions. We call them like-minded delegations. And also coalitions with all the other actors influencing the negotiators, all other stakeholders, NGOs, forces in the European Parliament, European national associations, large lobbying industrial groups, among others. Having said that, once you have prepared everything, unfortunately, Remy, the reality bites, in the sense that they might well cheat you. There is no sacred commitment or engagement binding those parties to whatever they have told you when building coalitions. There is no such thing, for example, as a permanent coalition of member states always voting the same thing. So coalition building, yes, this is what I had to say, tactical. Be ready to have the rats leave the ship, literally. The third factor is, again, the autonomy, but with another twist, if you allow me. It's the autonomy of the negotiator with a sufficient margin of maneuver, flexibility to operate in Brussels with the other delegations. But it's a double autonomy, in the sense that I think delegations successful have also negotiated going back to their capital and say, listen, you have instructed me to do this. It seems it's not possible. I have managed to secure this in Brussels. I urge you to consider what is on the table. So this is a wonderful two-way stream we see in EU diplomacy, which you hardly see anywhere else. These two ways of the negotiators. The fourth one is when EU negotiations are led, guided, piloted by two main institutional actors, which is the presidency we talked about, and it's the European Commission. You might say the European Commission doesn't vote, but the European Commission shares the same objective as the presidency. They want a deal. This is why they make a proposal. They want something. And these two will be drafting a compromise text. And you have to know what they do, and they have to hear you. They have to mirror your interests. So you have to lobby them more than anybody else. So the fourth factor is invest in the leaders of the negotiation. The fifth one is, if we look back at the unwritten rules, the fifth factor is being familiar with the informality of things. That means three actions in particular. You have to be available to exchange after hours, after the meeting. You have to socialize actively, and you have to be in as many WhatsApp groups as possible to exchange things, because it's very dynamic. It's moved just like that, and you have to, again, have a flexible mandate, know your stuff, know the others, and know what to sell back to your capital. If you manage this, you'll be quite effective. Last one, back to something I said, cultural awareness, or like the British used to say, or they still do, sorry, acclimatization. Let me find 2 or 3 situations where you should really wonder whether this is not a cultural pattern, a cultural difference. First, is your counterpart free to discuss, move, and accept your offers? Or does your counterpart have to follow strict, centralized instructions without authority to move, first having to report, first having to get a green light? If they are in a cultural system like that, don't bother. Don't bother offering them something. Yeah, because spend some good time, but don't expect anything. Crucial to know, because you have to manage your resources. Second, social practices. Do they share information? Are they sufficiently transparent? Do they send and trust young diplomats, for example? Young female diplomats. Some countries do, some don't. Now, is this an issue before you engage really into negotiating? Third, what about communication preferences? What about the role of emotions? What about people who talk more than the others? What about the number of kisses, Remy, when you go and greet people in Brussels? 1, 2, 3, 4 men? Do men give each other's kisses? Well, if you know that, you're in a better position to avoid cross-cultural accidents, to be credible, and to respect the other, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Alain, for sharing these 6 key success factors. I was, since you've called out for my opinion, I've been listening very carefully and also read your paper, of course, and very much enjoyed it. Some of them are context independent, right? So, in terms of preparation, right? It's something that we typically teach also in political or business context or legal context. You know your limits, know your interests, know your preferences, trade-offs, and red lines, and so on. Yeah. Some of them are super specific in the context of the EU, right? I was thinking, Alain, I was thinking about in this spectrum of key success factors, right? To what extent or which one of them would include things like negotiation craftsmanship, so knowing what to say and when to say it to whom, knowing negotiation methods, having negotiation intelligence, right? I have a feeling that it's in between many of those. But how important do you think is the knowledge of negotiation as a subject matter? In a sense that, to what extent it is important that these representatives, national representatives, before they go on and represent their countries in a multilateral EU context, that they first book you and your training, to get prepared and to become good negotiators first before they become EU negotiators. What do you think about that, Alain?
Oh, thank you, Remy. I think it is crucial, and I'm going just to give you one example of how crucial it is for the EU, the planet, the galaxy, and the universe, and even beyond. Does that make sense? Yeah, you see the dimension. In the sense that you might be, like you rightly point out, bogged down into so many different facets of the negotiation phenomenon, procedural, process-related, the people. And if you're a technician and a bureaucrat, you will come with what is often looks like the lowest possible common denominator, which makes sense for little arrangements, accommodations, and I believe the science of negotiation should not be restricted to finding as a compromise the lowest possible common denominator. To be more honest, I don't think we can afford any longer today only diplomatic compromises, which are not so ambitious, but keeps everybody sufficiently happy over 6 months, like we talked about. But we have a series of crises. We have a series of expectations from the citizens. We can't afford a lukewarm, half-baked compromise any longer, I think. And then another reason why we can't, and why we really need, together with these negotiators, think to increase the pie, as we say, not just stick to the compromise of the lowest possible value, but the EU is going to get larger. And the variety, the magnitude of differences between member states is going to be huge. I don't need to expand, but taking a decision to progress, to be the avant-garde of environmental protection, of social protection, is going to be more difficult in the decades to come, for obvious reasons. So we really have to think about this compromise building and move from a purely diplomatic, bureaucratic one into a more citizen-based, a European format, so to say, which links the objective of the EU in essence and not lose out the objective, the priorities of the EU and its citizens.
I know that with
I
my
speak like a
yeah.
politician now. I'm sorry, I speak like a politician.
I know
Vote
with
for
my
me.
yes. No, it's a very interesting point along that you've mentioned. So let me squeeze in a question which has popped up in my mind. So how can we do this without sacrificing some of the national autonomy, right? I mean, I know this question moves a little bit beyond the negotiation context, but there's still a fair bit of negotiation tactic and strategy in it, right? So the more participants, beyond 27, yeah, the more diverse the interest in the group, yeah, and the more difficult becomes to come down to a common denominator. So if the challenges become more pressing, such as, for example, environment, like you mentioned, or war, right? The conflict in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yeah? We need to somehow figure out a negotiation mechanism that does not focus on the least common denominator, but on the highest impact. So how can we move from the least common denominator approach that we seem to be, we seem to be pursuing for, 40, 60 years, at least in the past of the EU institutions, to making EU more impactful? Is it necessary to somehow sacrifice some of the national autonomy, or do you believe it's possible to pursue within the given structures?
Wow, fascinating question, Remy. Thank you. A lot of people find as a solution to your conundrum, the conundrum you raise, find the solution to reduce the autonomy of member states, which you raised, and that means more qualified majority voting, less unanimity, to impose things. Of course, it makes sense. Technically, it makes sense. But politically, you know that as much as I do. I mean, negotiating one thing is something, but then the object you've negotiated needs to be implemented, enforced. And if it's not enforced, accepted by the end users, then you failed, I believe, the negotiation. That pattern has to be factored in from the start, I believe. So I would think about something else. I would think about great leaders rather than leaders by default. Again, arrangement, lowest common denominator, somebody who would not be too noisy or too federalist or whatever. These leaders, we've seen them in the history of the European integration, and whenever we had a landmark actor like that, you saw the result into the capacity, into the agenda, and in the support of the EU. So that's one thing. And then the second one, and that's linked to my first point. It's a bit bold, but I have this idea, which is called transparency in a democratic system. And it goes like that. What if in every member state, in every region or province of every member state, in every municipality, every constituency, commune, village, each political party would have one platform of the same position. On environment, we believe this. On social protection, we mean this. On trade, we want this, not that. And you defend one platform anywhere. European elections, the leaders you propose to the European Commission presidency, whatever. And you do that. The parliamentarians you appoint, you elect, will defend that. The socialist commissioner will defend the same thing. And in the Council of Ministers, the country having the ruling majority will defend that. We know, and you discuss the interests without hiding, and you have the support of the people. I believe this is the only way to secure good agreements and supported agreements.
Thank you, Alain, for your wise words. Very much enjoyed it. So, picking up on great leaders, my last question is always about great negotiators. So, what are your favorites in terms of historical or contemporary negotiators? Who would you pick and choose as a role model, and why?
He has to be French, of course, huh? Yes, of course. Well, thank you. I'll pick one, but just to make the link with what we were discussing and negotiation theory, if I look at the theory, the competencies and skills of negotiators, some of them are empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of the other, play the devil's advocate against your own arguments. And I believe one negotiator in history truly personified all that, having literally put himself in the shoes of his opponents, rally his cause to save his head, not just once, twice, 5 times. His name is Talleyrand. He managed to become prince, a bishop, a revolutionary, a minister several times, and even an ambassador. Figure that, Remy. It all starts, if I remember correctly, by him becoming a young bishop. Then he's excommunicated. That's in the he was appointed ambassador in 1830. But figure that he becomes bishop. He's excommunicated because he was acting during the French Revolution. He was elected in the French Assembly of the revolutionary body. He was presided the assembly, and he wanted to seize the church's wealth and assets. So the church said, no way. Then he went on exile to the US. Imagine that. Then he comes back. He becomes minister. Then he plots to overthrow the regime. To put whom in place? Napoleon himself, a new emperor who will crown himself, not the Pope. So no need for the church anymore. Fascinating. He will sign for Napoleon peace treaties. He will recommend to Napoleon to have a strategic alliance marriage with Austria, with Marie-Louise d'Autriche. He privately, then parallel to that, he plots against Napoleon. He advises Russia not to sign any alliance with France, but to wait because the emperor, he thinks, will collapse. He asks the Tsar of Russia, support me in reinstating the former royal family. So the former royal of the Bourbon comes back. He becomes a minister of this new family. And after this one is gone, he becomes an ambassador. It's just fascinating. And again, oh yes, and the best of all in negotiation, his table was the best in Paris. And he had so many sentimental relations with the partners of his targets. So back to socialization for a purpose, right? So he's the best for me, if you ask me, because he materialized the recommendation of negotiation theory, which is to know your counterpart's interests and accommodate them to your own plan. It's fantastic.
Alain, thank you so much for sharing this. It seems that, if we are to draw a conclusion, it's probably too far reaching, but to become a great negotiator, you have to party hard. You have to party like Talleyrand. Alain, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much to the listeners out there, to the watchers, to the followers. Please stay tuned for our next podcast on negotiation. And until then, all the best in your negotiations. Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.